Hello, everyone. Good morning. You are with us in the Climate Governance Malaysia Round Series webinar 2025. Thank you for joining with us and with you. I'm Malar Odayappan from PwC Malaysia. My scope of work involves ESG and climate change, and I'm the country lead, as well as Vietnam lead for the S pillar in ESG. So today our title is related to the children, the young leaders, and the next generation that would be heading our country as well as the global requirements. So the title of our topic today is Children's Right in Climate Crisis, taking a generational approach to policy, governance, and business action. We have 5 esteemed speakers with us. Out of the 5, Celeste, who's supposed to join us, would not be able to make it. Unfortunately, she had a small accident this morning, which has made it difficult for her to join. So before I start, I would like to introduce the esteemed speakers for your understanding, as well as knowing who they are and why they are here before we start the conversation. Can I start with Ariff? Can you please introduce yourself?
Yep, sure. So hi everyone. My name is Ariff. I am the Advocacy Director for Youth United for Earth. So we're a youth-led NGO that focuses on climate justice and also youth empowerment. We run a few programs. We try to get the message out there to get young people involved in climate change. But I'm also part of UNICEF's Young People's Action Team. So yeah, nice to meet everyone.
Thank you, Ariff. Ariff will be our keynote speaker for today. And the panelist, I would like to start with Nasha. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nasha. I'm with UNICEF Malaysia. We are a UN agency that works on children's rights. And I am the lead for the climate and environment team at UNICEF, where we work on climate, environment, and disaster risk reduction with a focus on children and young people. Good to see everyone here today.
Thank you, Nasha. Tiffany, would like you to please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Tiffany. I also work with UNICEF Malaysia. I champion children at the intersection of business and human rights. I'm currently the business and child rights lead at the organization, and my role is to amplify youth voices in critical conversations around sustainability. So I work a lot with government, civil society, businesses, and multi-stakeholder organizations so that we can together build a more supportive environment for responsible business leadership. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Last, but the youngest in the team, as well as the most esteemed, Elmus. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Elmus. Nice to meet you all. I am an alumni of the UNICEF Young Leader Program, and I was also one of the participants in the recent Langkawi Declaration. And I'm so excited to be able to share with you what we have gathered and garnered and really spread the knowledge. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's our esteemed speakers for today. And just to set some context, we are talking about children's rights in the current climate change. What are the things that they're facing and what should be done? And some of the areas that we will be covering would be related to General Comment number 26 on children and the environment from the UN Committee on the Rights of a Child that was recently affirmed, as well as the Langkawi Declaration. So I would like to kickstart the conversation with Ariff. Please give us your insights on children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. So when we talk about children's rights, we are specifically talking about the Convention on the Rights of Children, 54 articles specifically. So these articles, give out basically a scope. What is a child? What rights are given to a child? What protection should be given, and things of the sort. It's been about 30 years since it's been introduced, and countries have slowly adopted it, especially in our region. which has been developing at a stable and steady rate, I would say. So children's rights are improving and it's being incorporated more and more into our governance space, but that does not mean everything is perfect. Countries like Malaysia, for example, have reservations to the CRC, to the 54 articles. Specifically, we don't follow or we don't adopt 5 articles. Out of two out of the 5 articles, so that's a lot of numbers, but out of the two out of the 5 that we have reservations on, the 2 set out to ensure no child can be discriminated against and a child has a right to a name and citizenship. The reasoning behind this is because it violates our constitution or it does not agree with our constitution and our dual legal system. And the thing is, this is not an isolated incident. We see these kind of arguments or reasoning throughout the globe to limit the scope of rights, be it environmental rights, children's rights, or human rights. So many different examples, and especially if we look in ASEAN alone, we can see the term ASEAN culture or ASEAN values used to shut down different discourse to basically expand what environmental rights means or what children's rights means, right? And these rights are constantly being threatened through natural causes like climate disasters or man-made like armed conflicts. But in both cases, even though they're very different, children are deprived from exercising their core rights. They're starved, they're denied education, they lose shelter, and in worst cases, their lives are taken. And it doesn't help that legislation tends to be outdated and efforts for intersectional interventions often put children as an afterthought, even though that sounds a bit oxymoronic. But why are rights so important? Why are children's rights so important? The truth is, without rights, there can be no justice. The whole point of children's rights is to ensure that children are protected from exploitation and from oppression or discrimination. So without rights, there can be no justice. Without rights, everything is fair game. So I want to focus, or I want you to rewind a bit because I want to focus on the natural causes that are threatening children's rights. And I want to talk about the intersection between that, businesses, and children's rights, right? For us, children and young people, the climate crisis is immediate, impacting about 580 million children in the region. So we're no strangers to climate disasters, with typhoons, floods, and wildfires disrupting our lives and education on the regular. This is something that punctuates the background of our daily lives. And our region is one of the most climate vulnerable in the world. The top 10 most climate vulnerable countries are countries within our region. UNICEF Malaysia reports high dropout rates post-disasters. When parents can barely scrape by to put food on the table, education is the least of their priorities, which makes sense. In the Pacific region alone, 3.8 million school-aged children are at risk of missing out education because of climate change. And when schools in the region close during disasters, 1/3 of girls do not return because of societal pressure and societal norms. The repercussions are severe. The learning crisis is further exacerbated, illnesses spread rampantly, displacement, and there is this constant fear of future disasters. There is a psychological scar. Specifically, in countries like the Philippines, which experience 20 typhoons per year. But education is just the tip of the iceberg. Last year, Typhoon Yagi caused the displacement of an estimated of 6 million children. And with the recent typhoons, this estimate is only expected to rise. Climate change is only getting worse year by year, and the planet is only getting warmer. So climate trends or weather trends are getting more sporadic, more violent, and more unpredictable. So entire futures are snuffed before they even had time to blossom. When I mention all these numbers, all these statistics, they are not just numbers on an Excel sheet. They represent real people with real lives, real dreams, and real ambitions. So when I talk about all of this, when it comes to the climate, who is to blame? Of course, the answer is not simple, and we can't blame just one singular entity. Climate change, what it really is a symptom of a worsening society. At the root of it, It is a sub-effect of colonialism. Colonialism has left many countries like ours in our region an indelible mark. What colonialism has done, global north countries have extracted and exploited countries like ours or those in our region, um, and and has produced the most amount of pollution in comparison to the global south. Yet we are the ones who experience the brunt of its effect. The estimated amount from loss and damages from climate disasters alone is about 5 trillion US dollars. But these governments, global north countries, these colonial powers are not acting alone. Their pollution is not just theirs alone. It is also an accumulation of corporations that are mostly based there. If we look at the numbers alone, since 2016, 57 companies have been linked to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can't simply blame governments, but businesses must also bear the responsibility. Of course, throughout the years, there has been efforts to curb this, from the Paris Agreement to the UN Guiding Principles and the Maastricht Principles. And there's so many other different frameworks and different guidelines to help curb this issue. But they all emphasize similar things, which is the protection of future generations, which is intergenerational justice, and the need to mitigate negative impacts on the climate. And of course, businesses have taken up this cause, championing ESG initiatives that often, unfortunately, ignore the human element of climate impacts and unfortunately end up greenwashing. The culprits are usually some of the wealthiest and heaviest polluters in the industry. But it gets worse. Projects carried out by certain businesses lack responsible human and environmental due diligence. So what happens? Vulnerable communities that are, of course, already vulnerable are put at further risk. Villages where operations like mining, forest, for logging, things like that occurs, become sacrifice zones. As the name suggests, they are sacrificed for the sake of the operation to reduce it completely. Some of the most famous example, we can look at Sungai Kim Kim, where because of illegal chemical dumping in the river, it caused over 110 schools to be shut down and more than 6,000 people to be affected. Health complications, people had to leave and find a new place to live, new schools, education was disrupted, entire lives were just uprooted at an instant. And more recently, we can look in Kelantan, specifically a specific kampung, Kampung Klait, where a Temia Orang Asli village found that their river has turned blood red. It used to be pristine and clean, but now it has been poisoned by iron, which has, again, poisoned them, leading to very slow and painful deaths. The ore comes from two mines, which has been in operations since 2015. And these are not one incident or two incident. These are becoming more and more common, especially as we move into the future and we need more and more of these minerals. Without stringent regulations, people's lives are put on the line for profits that will never reach these communities. Families are uprooted and children are poisoned. And this should not be the norm. Sacrifice zones should not be the norm. But what about projects that don't extract? What about projects that don't mine, but instead aim to reduce emissions? Because isn't that what we're aiming for? So let's zoom out a little and see this in play. Malaysia, as a country, is a heavily reliant on fossil fuel as a main source of energy, which contributes to up to 80% of Malaysian carbon emissions. With our nationally determined goals or nationally determined contributions targeting net zero by 2050. Of course, the next logical step was to transition, but it seemed that decarbonization often comes at the expense of others. And this is not just Malaysia, it's countries from all across the world, particularly indigenous peoples. For instance, projects like the Muram Dam highlight these injustices by displacing Dayak tribes without adequate consultation and free prior informed consent. Children and young people from those communities risk losing their culture and have already lost access to their ancestral land as they are uprooted and displaced. And we see this trend everywhere, and it is unfortunate that we see it. So it is quintessential that businesses that facilitate energy and economic transitions in this, era of moving towards a greener economy, a greener energy grid, to understand and uphold human rights practices. Because what's the point of going to a greener greener future if it leaves people behind? Children, the environment, and businesses all exist within an ecosystem. So we must not silo ourselves. To reach to the point where the development does not come at the cost of futures, we must work together. This fight, this justice, it must be intersectional and intergenerational. And me, myself, as a young person, and we as young people are not just going to be silent victims. We are here, we are working in NGOs, we have our demands. Some are students, some are working, but we are ready to work together with wiser generations. Young people should not be an afterthought. We shouldn't just be another box to tick off. We should be part of the planning, the designing, and the executing process. Our thoughts and inputs must be given equal dignity and respect. And honestly, the lowest hanging fruit is to just listen. Businesses, governments must listen to the communities and to young people to accept our ideas and our criticism regarding projects and solutions that they have. And of course, compensate us for the expertise that we bring. Only then can we create robust solutions. A child should be able to enjoy nature just as their parents did. My peers shouldn't have to worry whether their hometowns will exist decades down the road. Of course, we have so much ahead of us, and we must work with one another to ensure a brighter future is possible. Because at the end of the day, children should not have to fight just to live. They should not be forced to spend their childhood advocating. They should just be able to be children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariff. That was a very powerful note. I mean, quite impressed on it. So, from your perspective, climate action is ultimately an investment, not only on protecting the environment, but for the society and in particular the children. So, with that, I would like to take the conversation to Nasha. Nasha, based on what Ariff just said, I'm wondering, how is the climate crisis a child's crisis? I mean, Ariff was saying that our children get impacted, education, health, food system, and everything. But parents are the owners of most of these requirements to provide to the children. So, from your perspective and your experience working in this area, how is it a child's crisis, and how children's rights is being affected by climate change in Malaysia? Over to you.
Thanks, Malar. And hi, everyone. So maybe just to start the conversation going, I know that there's been quite some conversation in the chat group. I mean, we'd like to hear also where you're from, like what your interest is, but if you could share, one image that comes to mind when we talk about the climate crisis. What's the one thing that you picture when we talk about the climate crisis? I'd like you to respond in the chat, because I think it's quite important to set the scene in terms of the impacts we are facing here in Malaysia. So maybe I can start off also just to share, like when we do these engagements with children, with young people, and with various stakeholders, I think the image that often comes to mind is of a place very far away. We think about the climate crisis as melting ice caps, polar bears, rising sea levels, and it seems to be happening in a place that's very far away. But here in Malaysia, the climate crisis looks very different. I see some responses in the chat. It can look like a tornado in Klang, that something quite unexpected. We seldom see tornadoes here in Malaysia. It can be a flood that sweeps through a child's home in Kelantan, or a heat wave that forces schools to close, floods that happen every year, and it's getting much more frequent, not just happening in the monsoon season, and haze that keeps children indoor for weeks. And in UNICEF's perspective, the climate crisis is not just an environmental crisis, means that it's not just impacting the environment, it is a child rights crisis. And as Ariff has really eloquently put, it impacts children's rights in so many different dimensions. And why is our focus really on children? I think one thing to mention is also about the whole issue of justice, that children are the least responsible for this problem on climate crisis, but yet they bear the greatest burden. In a national youth climate change survey that UNICEF Malaysia conducted with UNDP Malaysia a couple of years ago, it showed that 9 in 10 people have said that they have already been impacted by climate and environmental hazards. So why our focus on children? Why are children so vulnerable to the climate crisis? I think their bodies and their minds are still developing. Children, as we know, they breathe faster, they absorb more pollutants. Because they are also shorter, so they are much more closer to the ground to all of these pollutants. Their bodies are less able to regulate heat. And in terms of the rights that are being affected, we hear a lot to do with health. Just a statistic to show you that around the world, 90% of the disease burden linked to climate change actually falls to children under the age of 5. And climate change leads to increased exposure to heat-related illnesses like heat stroke, respiratory illnesses from air pollution, and also waterborne illnesses and vector-borne illnesses that come from mosquitoes like malaria and dengue. And in Malaysia, where we have a situation where, we already have a nutritional crisis, we have 21% of children that are stunted. This is below the age of 5, 11% of children who are wasted, and nearly half of the children who are anemic. This actually leads to much greater stress on the health systems as well. And let's talk about the rights to education. I think one thing that we often don't realize is how much climate change and climate-induced disasters actually impact schooling and impact children's access to education. So things like floods, haze, and storms disrupt schooling for weeks at a time. And we've had, evidence of being on the ground, doing case studies of different areas where we actually see that this is especially prominent in underprivileged children or marginalized children, where in a previous report by UNICEF Malaysia, we show that 2 separate communities in Pulau Gaya in Sabah with a high degree of undocumented children, and also Pos Kuala Mu in Perak with a high degree of indigenous children, actually their school attendance drops by 40% during extreme weather events. So when we talk about the fact that education is actually, one of the most important criteria of basically ensuring a good future for a child, this becomes extremely threatened by climate-related events. And I think moving on also, there's the rights to protection that we often do not think about as well, because disasters actually increase the risk of violence, abuse, and displacement. And at a time where, if you're a child facing a flood and you get displaced from your family, there's a huge element of safety, a risk of feeling unsafe. That's also happening to you. So if you're a child in a B40 community, say in Terengganu, a climate event can actually mean that your parents who are fishermen can lose their jobs, and it can push them into child labor, or even girls can be pushed into early marriage or trafficking, just so that they can ensure that they have at least a more secure life for their families, which is against their will. And something to mention is during the 2024 floods, we see that, in a school that was used as a temporary relief center in Kota Baru, Kelantan, there was actually a case where a 23-year-old male construction worker raped a 15-year-old girl, and they just got acquainted at the center. So there's a lot of discussions that we need to have in terms of how climate change actually increases violence and displacement, and we need to ensure that children are safe even as they undergo disasters. One other thing that is becoming a real important issue that we need to be discussing about is the risk to mental health. So UNICEF Malaysia, we have regularly a lot of focus group discussions, consultations with children and young people over, what they want to see in their climate future. And time again, many young people have told us how climate change actually causes them to be anxious about their future. So the questions around what will Malaysia look like when we're older? Will we even have, a world that we can live safely? Can we be together with our families? Will we be displaced from our homes? I think it's something that's often on their minds. There's a lot of conversation around stress, anxiety, and for people who have gone through, really these traumatic events, there is a risk of getting post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So one thing I'd really like to highlight is we talk a lot about the climate crisis in Malaysia, about floods and all that, but one thing that's really a silent and deadly threat that I'd like to share is on extreme heat. It's something that's very under the radar. Heat waves is something we as a society are not prepared for. But our reports from UNICEF have shown that there's been a 4 times increase in the number of heat waves today compared to the 1960s. And we have solid evidence that extreme heat actually reduces learning outcomes, and there's a huge amount of impacts towards health. For pregnant mothers, for example, every 1 degree increase in temperature, average temperature, actually leads to a 6% increase in stillbirth risk. So our schools, as you know, many of them are not air conditioned. Outdoor workers have highest risk. The children, elderly are all at risk of extreme heat. And I think we as a society need to do better about being prepared against this risk and putting in plans and SOPs, especially for those among our societies that are most vulnerable. So I think one thing, Mala, you asked about, so, we talk a lot about children, right? But they are the surrounding ecosystems like the parents, teachers, that are really, really important in terms of how do we protect children against this risk? Like, how do we ensure that they are safe? How do we ensure that their potential is maximized against all these threats that we have in the climate crisis? Their roles are really important. I think parents, as a parent myself as well, like, I have the responsibility to make sure that my child is safe in the event that there's a flood happening, like storms, heat waves, and all that as well. Teachers are very important because they are the ones that are closest to the child in terms of education and the school. And we have had instances where teachers have been trained to be trainers, and they are in turn training students in their schools in terms of the risk of disasters and how to be better protected against that. Like very simple things like, when there's a flood, I have an emergency backpack with all the items that can keep me safe. And I think this is a crucial knowledge to be passed on. So it's not just about children knowing what to do, it's about the surrounding ecosystems being empowered to share that knowledge as well with them. So I also would like to share, that these instances that we talk about, right? How children's rights are being affected. So each of them, each child that is faced with a climate risk in Malaysia actually has a story to tell. They're not just numbers. I think the media likes to report on statistics, but every child that has gone through the climate crisis, a student trying to study in a hot classroom, a family rebuilding after floods, a young person that's worried whether their future will be safe, each of them has a story to tell. And I think it's our role to make sure that, the stories that they tell are not the stories of dread, but the stories of hope, a hope for a future where, you know, every child can basically lead the change, and adults also helping them to stay protected amidst the climate crisis.
Thank you, Nasha. That was enlightening. And I, as a parent myself, I would say the points that you have brought up is very, very relevant, right? And talking about heat waves, all of you must have heard and read in the papers the recent number of deaths in Mecca during the Hajj pilgrimage due to heat waves. And Saudi Arabia came with a new ruling on working hours during summertime. So during the maximum heat period, you're not allowed to work outdoors itself. Now in Malaysia, as you have said many times, our schools are not equipped with air conditioning, but the part is it's not only air conditioning, it's a ventilation system itself. So are we taking that into consideration? So speaking to that, I would say, the ecosystem matters. So which means it is a business for everyone. Child's rights is a business for everyone. And it's not only about protecting the environment itself, it's protecting the society, which compromises of children itself. So in context, children and climate change is everyone's business. So as such, a question to Elmus, right? So how would you clarify the intersection of children's rights and business environmental process from your perspective?
Hello. Thank you for passing me the question. Once again, hello everyone. My name is Elmus, and to really explain, um, businesses have this tendency, okay, when they talk about environmental processes and practices as protecting future generations, they tend to overlook certain experiences and realities that children and young people face. I think that the phrase protecting future generations itself, it comes from a good place, right? It speaks to this desire for legacy and long-term responsibility, which we all share, right? We all want to protect future generations, but it misses something crucial. It tends to frame the climate crisis as a challenge to be dealt with in the future. And for my generation, it is a present day reality. It's happening right now. And there are three key realities that are usually being overlooked. First, it tends to overlook the direct link between business operations and children's health today. Children are uniquely vulnerable to pollution because of their young age, right? So when we talk about industrial emissions, we're also talking about the rising rate of asthma and the health risks faced by communities near industrial sites. Second, it overlooks how the climate crisis is disrupting our lives as we speak. Right now, it's affecting us. So last year in Malaysia, floods displaced over 100,000 people. Think of the tens of thousands of children whose education was halted, whose homes were damaged, and whose sense of security was shaken. This is the cost of an economic model that is still too reliant on fossil fuels. And finally, I think this is important to say, it overlooks the incredible opportunity we have in this moment. Because by focusing only on the distant future, businesses miss this amazing chance to innovate and lead today. So, our call really is for businesses to see this not as no longer, oh, we have to manage this problem in the future, we have to prepare for these future generations, but instead as a present day reality to be solved. We invite businesses to shift their focus from distant future to urgent present because the children that you and I and everyone else here seek to protect aren't somewhere out there in a few years, a future generation. The children we seek to protect are here today. And protecting the future must start with protecting the health of the children who are living and breathing right now. Yeah, that's my explanation.
Thank you, Elvis. That's very powerful, right? Protecting the children of now. Actually, the children of now are the future leaders, right? Not only the future leaders, future innovators, whatever ChatGPTs that we have at present were innovated by the children of a certain generation, and it's become the ingoing thing at present. Now, when you speak about such things, a lot of times parents will say, these are my children, so I have every right to do as I deem correct towards my children. So in that genre, I'm going to ask Tiffany, how are global human rights frameworks, including for climate change and the environmental, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs, relevant to children in the context of business?
Thank you, Mala. Thank you for that important question. So when we talk about human rights and the environment, people often think first about governments. And when you think about international human rights treaties like the ones that you just mentioned, it was designed for governments, not companies. In reality, though, many of the ways people and children experience environmental harm are shaped by business activity, as Elmus had highlighted. Companies' decisions often determine whether communities, especially children, can live, learn, and grow in a clean and healthy environment. There is a low awareness of the links, both positive and negative, between the private sector, children, and climate change, and little guidance exists for business on how they can align with a child-sensitive approach to climate action or how they can effectively contribute to the solutions. So the impacts on children and young people are still broadly missing in business discussions, narratives, and proposed solutions to tackle the climate crisis. Without private sector engagement, though, and their investment and due consideration of children and young people in climate adaptation, mitigation, and community resilience-related actions, the global climate ambitions and the SDG targets will not be achieved. So where do companies' responsibilities begin and end? This debate isn't new. So if we can time travel a little bit to 2005, there was a real tug of war over business and human rights. Civil society and non-governmental organizations said companies have the power, they must protect human rights. But businesses said, we're not governments, we can't ensure everyone's rights. And so governments right smack in between didn't know what to do. To break this stalemate, our UN Secretary General at that time, Kofi Annan, appointed Harvard professor John Ruggie to define what human rights mean for companies and what they don't. Ruggie's mission resulted in one of the most wide-reaching consultations ever done at the United Nations. After 6 years of global consultation, something rare happened. In 2011, every government in the UN Human Rights Council agreed. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were born, and they remain the global standard today. So the UN Guiding Principles gives us something very essential. They don't create new laws, but they create clarity. Governments have the duty to protect human rights. And so where businesses come in is they have the responsibility to respect them. They have to avoid causing harm, and they have to act when impacts occur. What's most critical that the UNGPs highlight is that companies have to go beyond financial materiality, but to prioritize actions based on issues that impact people. And when we speak about people, these are also people within vulnerable communities, including children. Now we're extending that same clarity of the UNGPs to the environment. When we talk about climate action in business, we often think about carbon, energy, or supply chains, but rarely about children. Most companies still don't see how their operations, products, or policies shape children's futures or how children could shape better solutions. As companies move toward net zero, invest in nature, and strengthen your sustainability strategies, the question is no longer whether human rights, including children's rights, belong in the conversation, but how can they become part of the minimum standard for credible, forward-looking business practice? Because when businesses respect the right of every child to a clean and healthy environment, they are not only protecting human rights, they are also investing in stable communities, a healthy workforce, and a sustainable future market. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So UNGP, right? So the part about respect and protect comes into play from the government as well as the businesses. I mean, being a human rights practitioner and somebody who leads the S pillar within PwC, I mean, I totally can understand on that part of it. Now, when you're talking about UNGPs and everything, initially we spoke about our general comment number 26, one part of it. So I'm wondering if Nasha, if you could give us a perspective, how UNICEF sees this and how it's important towards children's rights in the current climate difficulties.
Yeah, so the general comment number 26 is affirming that government must ensure every child's right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's actually a pretty big deal for UNICEF and also for children everywhere, because for the first time in history, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child made it very clear that governments have a legal duty to make this right real. That means governments have a legal duty to protect children's rights to a clean environment. This is important because it really puts children as the focus, as the right holder, and not just simply as a vulnerable stakeholder group that needs to be taken into account for. I think just now Ariff mentioned also there's a risk for us in these situations to go through this idea of just having children and young people there as a tick boxing exercise, right? And I think this really makes it very very certain that children have to be consulted in these decisions, and that they have to be considered as a right holder. So actually, like, I think maybe I'd like to share also in terms of how we can how we can do this in Malaysia in terms of the policy and the governance framework. So how can this be a reality for us? We have quite a number of the steps already that we still need to push a lot more, but like we have a good foundation. So first thing would be to to embed a child rights approach in all our climate and environmental policies. So this means that children cannot be treated as an afterthought. They must be really recognized as a right holder with entitlements to protection and participation. So when these policies are designed, we need to ask, how can we best protect children from climate risk? How can we ensure their meaningful participation? So every major plan that is being developed, for example, like the National Adaptation Plan that's currently under development by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability, or like the Nationally Determined Contribution, which is our country's national pledge to the Global Climate Framework, even state level climate strategies, we need to explicitly consider children's risks and also include measures for them. So we have an opening now with the National Adaptation Plan, because this is something that is currently in the works to be published next year. Currently, we don't have children being mentioned as a right holder specifically, and I think as this plan develops, it'll be really important to see how we can protect children's health, their education, their rights to protection, to participation in a really meaningful manner. And we have a lot of these building blocks, as I mentioned before. We've had a lot of conversations with the ministry also on children's inputs being provided towards the national adaptation planning. This Thursday, UNICEF together with NRES, the Environment Ministry, will be holding a youth climate adaptation lab to collect young people's feedback and ideas on how we can, charge up climate communication, education, and public awareness. So we'll be able to get some really good inputs from young people as well in terms of what they want to see in the National Adaptation Plan. And UNICEF Malaysia, we are currently developing a subnational children's climate and disaster risk index. So this is a really important data platform that can help governments identify which children are most at risk and at where, so that we can direct investments and policies that can help, protect children against this risk. So some other, recommendations from me would be to strengthen the coordination across ministries and sectors. I think when we talk about climate change, everyone talks about NRES, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability. And I think, based on our experience, climate risks really don't sit neatly within one portfolio. So the climate mandate cannot sit just within NRES. It cuts across every element like education, health, water, and social protection. So we really do need a whole of government mechanism to ensure that climate resilience is built into every service that a child or a young person depends on. So in UNICEF, we have a new program called Climate Resilient Social Services. And that's what we think is the most effective measure of climate adaptation for children. This means that we need to ensure that schools remain safe and cool during floods and heat waves, health systems that can detect and respond to dengue or heat stress or haze, and also social safety nets for families that can, protect their incomes when the disaster strikes. So UNICEF is working with various ministries to bring this element together. But I think what's really needed at this point is to have a structured interministerial platform that links children's rights or human rights with climate governance. And the third point for me would be that it's very important to have meaningful and sustained participation of children and young people. We have experience seeing that when we empower young people to lead, they really do wonders. They really are able to mobilize community in ways that we have never witnessed before. Young people are such a great voice for change, for advocacy, for urgency. I think it's undeniable that young people will be the ones facing these impacts. And so naturally, their voices come out really strongly. And meaningful and sustained participation means that not only do we have children and young people at the table where decisions are being made, but then that they are also being able to provide inputs to the planning process right from the beginning. Malaysia has made really encouraging progress. I really like to highlight this in terms of championing children and young people's participation. An example that I'd like to give was for the recently launched Nationally Determined Contribution, the NDC 3.0, or our National Climate Pledge, where the Ministry of Environment had worked with UNICEF to conduct 15 focus group discussions compiling voices of children and young people from across Malaysia in terms of the inputs for the NDC. And we see that the NDC 3.0 now reflects commitments on children's education, commitments on how to protect children against this risk of disasters. And another example will be the Langkawi Declaration, which is really a main outcome of the ASEAN Children and Youth Climate Summit that UNICEF organized together with the Ministry of Environment, basically bringing together ASEAN youth from all the different countries, having a really strong voice in terms of a roadmap of what the ASEAN countries need to put in place to protect children's rights to the environment. And this was presented to all the ASEAN ministers at the ASEAN ministers meeting on the environment. So I think the general comment number 26 is going to be a really important piece of work. I think it will apply to all different government ministries, private sector, and stakeholders because it gives us actually a really clear framework that this issue needs to be prioritized. So fulfilling the general comment number 26 is really how to have this governance in place that we can listen to children, we can plan with evidence, and we can act across sectors.
Thank you, Nasha. That's lots of explanation on General Comment 26. And you did take us into Langkawi Declaration, which happened recently. Now, Elmus, you have been vocal in your thoughts, right? And children being vocal is important, to understand their thought process, where they are, and the kind of stuff they expose at present compared to my time is totally different. So, talking about the future, and talking about what the Langkawi Declaration has brought forward, could you give us your perspective on what Langkawi Declaration is all about, and what kind of actions young people are asking businesses to take? Over to you.
Okay. Thank you again for giving me the question. As mentioned before, I was one of the opportune participants among so many different youths from all across ASEAN who was able to participate in the giving of the Langkawi Declaration. And just a quick summary of it, it's basically all these wonderful young minds coming together to really list down just this big declaration of what we as young people demand from the governments, from the futures, and from the leaders of the country to ensure that the leaders of the future will be able to take care of it better. But what I want to focus on here is what actions we ask businesses to take through the Langkawi Declaration, as in businesses in particular. And our message, as captured in the Langkawi Declaration, is of collaboration. See, we see the business community not just as one of the biggest sources of the problems you could say that are happening right now, but as one of the most potential sources of the solution, right? And in the declaration, we are calling businesses to lead. And we have a clear four-part roadmap for what leadership looks like, right? So, first, we would like to ask that businesses lead with responsibility. This means that making the rights of a child a core part of their business strategy, right? It means that we want businesses to conduct child rights impact assessments to ensure that from the very beginning, the projects that they do empower communities rather than harm them. Secondly, it's to lead with innovation. We know that sectors like industry, agriculture, and I think someone mentioned in the chat just now, the medical industry are responsible for a lot of global emissions. And this is not a blame game, ladies and gentlemen, right? This is just the nature of the industry itself and the way that we've lived, the lifestyle that we've had this entire time, right? It's about realizing that there is an opportunity. This is the moment to lead the transition, for these industries to lead the transition by phasing out fossil fuels and investing in clean energy and sustainable agriculture of tomorrow. This is the greatest innovation challenge of our time. And thirdly, leading in partnership. Now, let's stop the culture of tokenism and having youth around just to have youth around. Youth are valuable partners. We have lived, are living, and will continue to live in these crises if nothing happens. We invite businesses to create genuine partnerships with youth to co-design the solutions that will define a sustainable and profitable future. And finally, leading with investment, right? So, true leadership. And businesses can definitely profit from this, means investing in the systems that will protect everyone. This means contributing fairly to funds like the Loss and Damage Fund that help communities recover from climate disasters. It's about recognizing that investing in a community and its resilience is one of the smartest investments a business can make. So, overall, the Langkawi Declaration, it's not just a list of demands. It is a blueprint for a sustainable and prosperous future. And what we are asking businesses to do by reading it and by going through it and by listening to the declaration is we are extending an invitation to every business leader to help us build that sustainable and prosperous future together. So that's basically the rundown of it.
Elmus, you make a sound point towards businesses getting the young people to involve in the decisions, not decisions, but at least the policies. True, when workforce and then the parents are working in a company, are impacted by disaster, climate change kind of stuff, when the children are not well, sick, can't go to school, the parents can't actually focus on doing their jobs. So in a way, it impacts efficiency. So making sure that children are taken care, even by businesses in a proper manner, would actually benefit the business itself. Now, we have all run through different areas. While we are, before we go into questions, I'm wondering if each one of you would say what one area matters the most, or one area that you think we should do differently in the next 6 months that would impact the child's right in the context of business, government, or in general itself. I mean, if you come back and tell me the kindergartens that we have are not providing the children the kind of support they need or the education they need, that makes sense too, right? So let's start with Ariff. You want to say something from your end?
Yeah, I think for me, if we just want to look for the next 6 months, the thing that could make the most impact in terms of in terms of climate change as a whole, I think is just how we communicate it. The most important part throughout this entire issue is how we communicate it to the people that are the most vulnerable, to parents, to students, to young people, so that not only are they interested, but they can actually take actionable steps. I think there is this tendency when we talk about climate to over intellectualize and make it too complicated to the point that the entry point for the common folk is so high that instead of caring about the environment, caring about the world that's collapsing around them, there is just straight up apathy. So I think to summarize, what I would do, or if I could change one thing very quickly, is how we talk about climate change, increasing the amount of communication that we have, be it through news channels, the way that the government talks about climate change, or the conversations that we have about it. Of course, in reality, that's a whole nother can of worms, but that's what I would do.
So better communication, or the way that it should be communicated, whereby even the layman can understand. So once the common people get the message, it's very easy for them to teach children, right? So as you say, climate change, everyone talks about 1.5 degrees, everyone just sees it as numbers. So the communication part is actually very important. Thank you, Ariff. Nasha, your thoughts?
Yeah, so you asked about like the next 6 months. I think that's a really easy way to kind of simplify the most important thing that I would champion for. And I think that it's really, we do have, as I mentioned, like a really important opportunity with the National Adaptation Plan that Malaysia is developing. I think now is the time to look at how we can ensure that children and young people are able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Because it's really, as we focus on, mitigating climate change, reducing emissions, that's important as well. But for a country like Malaysia, where we are quite a small part of the whole global emissions, and where we are already seeing huge impacts to children, I think it's really important to include them into the commitments at the sector level for the National Adaptation Plan. And this will mean that we focus specifically on those who are most vulnerable in our society. People with disabilities, children with disabilities, girls, B40 communities, indigenous children, and we need to consider the needs in every element of the National Adaptation Plan, from health to water resources, disasters to agriculture. And I think something really important is that we need to also ensure that these plans are not just words on paper, they are actually implemented, and budgets are allocated to implement the plan.
Okay, nice segue, right? National Adaptation Plan, taking into consideration all the different elements that comes into it. And as you pointed out earlier, it's not a responsibility of one ministry, it's across. And with ASEAN summit being held now, we can see a lot of different perspectives coming out, leaders bringing it in. As you said, when you open up the internet, conflicts and how children are being impacted comes out all the time. So even though it's far away from us, but the impacts are very close to us, right? So in that point, Tiffany, what would you say from a UNGP point of view on this?
Thanks, Mala. Thanks for that really great question. As Nasha said, when you frame it within 6 months, it makes everything really, just drilling down to the most priority actions. I think I would like to highlight two key points. And the first would be when we build for children, we build for everyone. So I would work closely with the ministry and especially the Ministry for Law and Institutional Reform, which recently just set into motion and launched the National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights. So we speak earlier about different ministry covering different aspects for the climate crisis. With the National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights, we have the unique opportunity to bring all of these different ministries together. Within the specific National Action Plan, there's also a line for businesses to conduct due diligence as it pertains to children. So that's where I would start. Embedding children's rights within that environmental action, especially within human rights due diligence. And that would have companies then really articulate their policies to ensure that their policies are considering children as a key and important stakeholder. It means that companies then include parents and community groups that advocate and work with children on the ground, as well as children and young people, to also be consulted within the human rights due diligence process. And as Elmus highlighted earlier, impact assessments. It needs to consider how children's well-being are affected. I think in terms of human rights due diligence, we often forget after impact assessment. We stop typically at impact assessment. But the UNGP calls us to do more than just assess impact. It calls us to take action on the impacts that have been identified. How would you mitigate it? How would you prevent it for the future? And lastly, do children and young people and their families have a simple and easily accessible reporting mechanism to highlight impacts that they are facing in their daily lives? I think when we are able to ensure that companies really center their human rights due diligence on children, then they will be able to design mitigation that work for the whole community. Because as I highlighted earlier, when we build for children, we build for everyone. My second point would be, we often say in the sustainability world, what isn't measured isn't managed. But let's make children's well-being the true indicator of success or progress. If the goal is to leave the environment better than we found it, then children, the ones who are growing up in our same environments, are the clearest measure of whether we are succeeding. Let's look at double materiality more closely. Let's design our sustainability processes and policies to respond to the real needs that people, especially children, face in the environment. At UNICEF, we've been able to create a supportive environment to enable business to do this. We've developed tools and guidance that have been contextualized to the different maturity levels and size of businesses to enable businesses who are even in the micro enterprise level to begin already considering human rights due diligence within how they do ESG or their sustainability processes. That's a 2 point from me. Thank you.
Okay, so it's all about due diligence and what matters most, because without the data, you can't measure, and without the measure, you wouldn't know the impacts itself, right? So one of the things that I normally bring it to my counterparts and my area of expertise is, it's more about identifying what's the potential risk. because most of the time, when you do the due diligence, as you said, is an assessment at present, taking into consideration the silent killers. It has never happened now, but it might due to other mitigating action. That needs to be reviewed as well. So, having said that, Elmus, what would your 6 months look like?
Elmus is experiencing a power cut, so
Oh.
he's currently
that's-
unavailable.
Yeah, that's another part of the climate change itself. You know, the differences of when a heavy wind happens and stuff like that. Is Malaysia built with the kind of infrastructure that can withstand the climate change? That's another story by itself and not for today's discussion. But yes, you know, this comes into play. Children's education gets impacted if the infrastructure is not there, right? So while we wait for Elmas, let's run through the questions that we have in the chat. Now, one of the things I would like to bring forward, yes, what do you call animals' rights is important. It's part of the environment and it's also part of the climate change situation. I was once asked, why am I seeing a lot of monkeys in our residential area? Well, we took their residential area and built our residences. So where are the monkeys supposed to go? Correct? So how does that impact the children? That's another story by itself. Correct? So let's run through the questions that we have on the chat list. And I'll start with the first one. Should the mining of rare earth elements be allowed in forest reserves, particularly forests on central forest mine and especially in those forests that happens to be part of tiger landscape and tiger expected areas as identified by the Department of Wildlife and Nature Parks in Peninsula? This is, I think, a question that should go to one of the environmental practice team members because they would know more about this. But I'm just wondering if Nasha or Tiffany, you could give some insights into this because rare earth elements it's an income to the state, but when you do mine it, there's going to be other impacts as well to the environment. So any insights on that? Nasha, do you want to take a look at it?
I can take this one. I think it's an area that is increasingly becoming more popular and more mainstream. I think Malaysia's rare earths, materials have been like the subject of a lot of international interest. So I think I would like to approach it from like the equity kind of lens because these critical ecosystems, I think they are a really important part of children's well-being and the well-being of us generally as a community, right? When we degrade forests or, for example, like pollute waterways or disrupt ecosystems, there will be a lot of issues that we don't foresee, especially to the communities that are living in the nearby vicinity. A lot of these are indigenous and rural communities, and they are the ones that will bear the long-term consequence. So our take for, and I think Tiffany can also share on this, like UNICEF's take for mining in general is that we need to also look at how the mining will affect children, impacts in terms of water quality or air pollution, soil contamination. These all impacts children's health, their nutrition, and their development. So our main principles will be that we do no harm to children, and we look at ways that we do not leave especially vulnerable children behind. So I know that there's been some guidance around extractive industries within UNICEF. So we have to look at how to exert, precaution and protection, especially to children who often don't have a say in these major investment projects.
Totally agree on that because the impacts comes in. And Tiffany, earlier you mentioned about risk assessments. right? So the human rights due diligence doesn't take into 100% the concern of environment, but environment impacts that goes into human rights is part of the assessment itself. Do you have anything to say about that? And if possible, could you also address, the importance of tiger in the long-term existence in forests in relations to the above question on no, REE. Correct. So,
Thank you, Mala. Thanks, Nasha, for kicking us off. I think Nasha makes a really important point. But I think also in addition to impact assessment, we really need to dial back and really understand the responsibilities discharged to governments through all of these international human rights treaties. It holds the government responsible to protect human rights within their jurisdiction and their territories. So I do note here in terms of loopholes that were suggested, but I think it's important for governments to really consider and seriously take that proactive action. Recently, we had the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, where it was really the push by children and young people. And so if our governments do not consider these responsibilities really seriously, what they've already signed up for, then there will be increasingly more and more instances where there will be court cases and legislation rules, and governments will be held responsible for not protecting the human rights within their jurisdiction, not also then ensuring that businesses that are operating within their entities are abiding by the human rights needs within their jurisdictions as well. And then this then looks in especially to children's rights. You made a good point in terms of children and young people not having a say in all of these processes. And this is where then again, the importance of international human rights treaties, right? Because that's where the specific mention of stakeholder engagement has been put in. And when we talk about stakeholder engagement, this includes stakeholders within the most vulnerable communities. And when you speak about most vulnerable communities, then it includes children and young people. So if children and young people are not directly engaged and consulted, that is a problem. And if it's not exactly possible to engage directly with children and young people, there needs to be an express commitment to at least engage with organizations or communities that are working directly with children and understanding the needs and impacts that children face with all of these different examples. Thank you.
okay, thank you, Tiffany. That's where I would totally agree. It's not about looking into the tiger conservation or about rare earth. Yes, all these are needed for different parts of our lives and also the growth of the economy. But when it impacts people, everything we have, there was a comment in the Q&A that says that we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from the children. Yes. So whatever we do now, there's an impact to the young people who will become the leaders of the future or the grown-ups of the future. As such, the impact itself, if it's assessed, current impact, potential impact that would cause difficulties for people, then automatically these situations can be addressed in a different manner. Okay, so Tiffany, that was a very good point on that. Now, Ariff, there's a question for you on the chat. With Trump's recent visit and potential of more trade on rare earth, how would you say, this is a bit tough and off the cuff. So let's say from your perspective, how do we take actions to mitigate or to balance our trade export demands and GDP target with current situation related to children and society in general?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I mean, of course, that is a pretty loaded question. My general stance on REE mining, or rare earth element mining is if we can minimize it, we should minimize it. But I understand it is a source of our economy, the same way that we can't simply, cut off our fossil fuels. We have to slowly transition out of it, and there are ways to do it. Um, yeah, it's just a lot. There are like two questions, right? Basically, one on rare earth, and the other one is about how we can work with past dominated area to alleviate future pains. I'll start with the second question first. So I think with and sure, Nasha and Tiffany can also add a bit later because they work more closely with these communities, I would say. But at least from my perspective, and members of our organizations who live in, like, for example, in Terengganu, which is also past controlled, the issue is not necessarily the governance, but also how we communicate things. I know I keep saying communication is a big deal, but genuinely, I think that accountability doesn't just simply come from the government, it also comes from the people itself. And if the people are not aware of what's happening and the responsibility of the state government in ensuring that, proper mitigation measures, or like proper like, for example, coastal erosion, right? If we are not aware, if the people are not aware what the state government can actually do, and the politicians can basically blame it on the federal government, etc., then you're not getting anywhere. So I think first and foremost is how can we get the information on what is happening in terms of climate, what can we do in order to mitigate the impacts of it. That is the first thing that we need to do, I would say. And the issue is the way that we communicate things, or the way that we look at things here in KL is so much more different than there. I remember one of our members talking to her friends who are not part of the climate scene at all. She is a KL person, but she moved to Terengganu. And she was talking to her friends who was talking about the climate movement, or rather KL people in general, and why kita suka angkat spanduk, right? Why we like to protest and things like that. I don't want to generalize because I am not from that area, but generally people Malaysians are not super confrontational. We want to take things as, everyone's happy, we don't have to fight about it. How can we, get to that point? And I think that is how we have to approach things when communicating, to ensure there is no communication breakdown, to ensure that future pains when it comes to floods, deforestation, which is a big issue there, transparency in terms of the funding coming in, and the actual projects that are ongoing there. I think there is a communication breakdown, and it's really up to the people there to, how do you say, like, to bring accountability. I'm sorry if this doesn't answer the question fully, but honestly, that's how I think it should go. It's the people are just not aware that it's happening, or are just not aware who are the specific actors that are responsible. So without knowing who the specific actors are, you don't really know who you want to bring to accountability. I think also different, different state governments have different approaches in terms of their governance as a whole, and what they see in terms of climate governance. And again, I can only comment very briefly on it. But I mean, we can look at the climate change bill. It took quite some time for them to actually get consensus from each state government to say, like, okay, they will actually do this if this comes into law. So, it's really, again, I'm just repeating myself, but honestly, the people need to know what's happening. And when people know what's happening, then accountability can occur. With Trump's recent visit, well, my opinion on Trump is a whole another issue. But then I think Malaysia needs to be more cautious with how we approach financial opportunities. To say at the very least, that this doesn't just apply to rare earth elements. It also applies to things like carbon capture utility systems, which we passed a bill, and it was purely done through a financial perspective. There wasn't adequate NGO or CSO what do you say, consultation. And even when there was consultation, you were only given a framework, and you couldn't even read what was going to be inside of the bill. And so I think in terms of these kind of things, Malaysia needs to be more proactive, or more open to a more how do you say, like detailed human rights due diligence and environmental rights due diligence. So then, when you set up these mining operations, the off the what do you call it? The effects of that mining does not affect the children and youth in that area, and it doesn't just extend that, because the impact of mining in a specific region will, spread. I just can't get the specific word I want to find in my head right now, but it will spread to further regions if you do not contain it and if you do not plan and do proper due diligence um for those mining operations. And so, summing it up, I think we can't be so antsy, like, okay, the trend is rare earth elements, and so we want to ramp up everything, right? I'm hoping, and I'm really hoping, that we see across these few years, as we progress into the future, that there is a more robust plan of action, and especially with the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights that came out. I think and I hope it will be, any operations that we plan to engage in the future will be more comprehensive and won't come at the cost of communities, at children's, at people's lives, and at more pollution. Because what's the point of development if people are dying?
Nicely said, Ariff. Okay, so NEPBPHR is something that has garnered a lot of attention nationally as well as internationally. Putting it into practice is of utmost importance. As me, I've worked in different countries, and building the human rights aspects of it into operations is a tough cookie to crack. And it starts with stakeholder engagement, and mapping all the stakeholders is of utmost importance. Now, we don't have much time. I'd like to give one question to Mr. Elmus. There's a question in the Q&A that talks about schools and kindergartens encouraging kids to plant vegetables. How can you take it bigger to the community with adults, parents? And they're saying that from a young age versus feel good activity to something that makes sense. I mean, that's really bringing in importance to the lives. Planting vegetables, defending earth, different activities that young children are taught to do. How could we cultivate it to the elders? Your thoughts, Almas?
Sorry, I can't look at because the Q&A question is gone for me since I rejoined. So could you just rephrase the question in like a nice and simple sentence, right? Uh, I'm sorry, I think you're muted. Yeah, no worries, Malar.
Sorry, Elmus. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that children in kindergarten are encouraged to plant vegetables in schools, etc. Right? So, how can we take it further into the community where adults, parents, different community members could also embed it into their lives?
Okay, I think I got the gist of it. Um, that's a great question, right? And it gets to the heart of how we create lasting change, because at the end of the day, right, we can teach kids to do all these environmentally friendly activities, right? But if it's not integrated into their lifestyle, then it's just something they do at school, and then they go home, and then they end up just leaving that knowledge behind. And it's why education at a certain point should not only be something that's taught to children in a sense, but also to the lifestyles and the people surrounding them, like their parents. So for this question, to kind of take it further, right? We have to make these sort of changes and this sort of education visible and collaborative. So, for example, with the idea of gardening in primary schools, in kindergartens, my little sister does it too, right? We can expand the school gardens into this community gardens. And that's where we really bring in communities. So instead of activities only being held in schools and in an educational system enclosed in that building, we can make it a community project. And I feel community projects are really the way to go in terms of changing the mindset of as a whole, because it includes parents, it includes the stakeholders who are involved in going to these community gardens. It involves the people who are visiting the community itself, and we can also try and take in the humane aspect of a lot of these. Now, sustainability shouldn't feel like a chore, right? It shouldn't feel like a lecture to people who are listening. Even in this webinar, when we talk about these important discussions and these important reality checks, it shouldn't feel like, hey, this information, you observe it. It should feel like a conversation. It's always a conversation between me and you who are listening, me and the stakeholders, and human beings and the earth, a conversation in how we keep each other grounded, in how we keep each other sustainable. So we make it social and fun. We have a community garden, we organize a community cleanup, we have a webinar talking about all these things so that not only the children are listening, but the parents are listening as well and understanding, okay, so this is how we get involved, this is how we get interested. And finally, I think by itself, it will be very rewarding and directly beneficial just to teach people, to teach the parents, to teach the community about how effective these sort of activities really are. When you learn how to plant trees, you learn how to make you learn how to have your own greenery, right? When you learn how to compost, you learn how to cut waste. When you learn how to energy save, you learn how to save money on the electricity bills, all these things. So it's, I don't really have too deep of an answer, but just more general things that I believe a lot of people here probably have the suggestions on and probably kind of know on how to do. But I'm just kind of rounding it down to an easy like bullet point list, right? So that's for me.
Thank you, Elmus. So if it is just a one activity, very silo kind of thing, and if the parents and elders are not involved, it doesn't really make the point that it has been started for, right? It doesn't meet what we want to achieve. Now, while talking about meeting points and targets and achieving, I'm just wondering if all the panelists are just very short, less than like 30 seconds. What do you think about KPIs, the current KPIs that we have for different areas, for developers, for human rights, for industries, for businesses? What do you think about the KPIs and how is it being integrated into implementation? Anything, a second. 30 seconds of your thoughts. Anyone wants to go first? Or Nasha, do you want to try?
Sure. About KPIs. So I think that it's really important to have KPIs that focus not just for the sake of achieving things, but really focus on people. We need to measure how people's lives are being impacted or how they could potentially benefit from climate action. So I think having that lens on people would be important in every kind of KPI, be it in the private sector or government. Having that focus on people is extremely important.
Okay. Tiffany, what is your thought on KPIs?
So the way I see it is when we develop KPIs, we also need to be cognizant of children's well-being. Are we expressly mentioning children's well-being within our KPIs? Are we, to take Ariff's words, are we communicating that KPIs to the general public? Are we communicating on the progress that we've made on the KPIs? And in the way we are communicating, are we making it child-friendly and accessible for children and young people to also understand this loaded word of KPI that may be very business-centric and not exactly to the understanding of children and young people? So just to underscore that we really need to ground it, again, as Nasha mentioned, in children and young people. And I will go a step further to have that KPIs also reflective of children's well-being.
Okay. Thank you, Tiffany. Anyone else? Or Nasha, do you want to try?
Sure. About KPIs. So I think that it's really important to have KPIs that focus not just for the sake of achieving things, but really focus on people.
you. Now, Ariff, I'm not going to go to you on KPI itself, but I'm just wondering, the children's primary school syllabus, right? So if climate change is to be included into it, how do you think this KPI thing plays into the syllabus?
Yeah. I think KPI in general, like my thoughts is that there should be hyperlocalization, which what was basically what was mentioned just now. I think in terms of the syllabus, I guess before you even plan anything is just to ensure that teachers have adequate support and adequate resources. The syllabus contains a lot of stuff, and the government should not work in silos. Unfortunately, right now, the way that we govern is very dispersed. And climate is not a one ministry issue. It's multiple ministries that have to work together. And sometimes they don't want to sit at the same table. And especially with the Ministry of Education, they're quite stubborn sometimes when adding new things to the education syllabus. So how the KPI could work, I don't really know, but what I do know is that it has to involve the stakeholders that are going to be carrying out and experiencing it. It has to involve students. It has to be involved, of course, people like UNICEF, NGOs, civil societies that have been doing climate education. And it cannot just be scientific. It has to have that human element, which I think is universal in terms of the KPI or whatever. It shouldn't just be like, oh, CO2 increasing, therefore climate change. It should be what are what is the anthropogenic part of anthropogenic climate change, right? So I think that's how it could work. It should involve people, it should involve teachers, students, children, whoever it is. And especially these terms should not be complicated. It should be broken down and it should be translated into Malay and our local languages, which I think is especially important because we do not have enough words to communicate efficiently what is going on in terms of policies and things like that.
Thank you. Well said. Elmus, KPIs, but added element to it, in getting business to lead children's rights. What is the strongest selling point to convince them from your thoughts?
Right. Um, I'm not too equipped to answer about KPIs in particular. However, the strongest selling point I believe to convince businesses is that when you invest in children's rights in a healthy environment, it's it's the best long-term investment a business can make for long-term success. And I'll round it down very simply into three reasons. First, you secure your future customers. Who are your customers? Parents who are loyal to brands that they trust with. Eventually, those parents will pass on the trust of the brand to the children who become parents, blah, blah, blah. And it's like generational to generational, right? Secondly, it attracts and retains your future talent. Right now, there's a war for talent. Young and innovative and passionate people want to work for companies that have purposes beyond profit, right? Young people now more than ever care about the business values and the values, ethical values overall of businesses. And because of that, when these businesses have these values, they are more likely to attract these young, innovative, and passionate people. And thirdly, it guarantees your future resilience. Now, a business, this has been mentioned before, a business cannot thrive in a community that is failing. If your community is gone, if the climate around you is destroyed, then what do you have left to really run? You wouldn't have a business if you don't have a community. So those are the three reasons. And it's not a cost, right? It's not, at the end of the day, business is all about investing. And if there's one investment that you can make, particularly for the future, it's investing into these young people because they are the future.
Well said. Thank you, esteemed panelist. Now, for me, wrapping up everything, I would say in a nutshell, children are not just the future, they are the present, living today with consequences of our choices. I mean, which all of you have been saying it continuously. What we have discussed today reminds us that protecting child rights is not a one-day conversation, but an ongoing commitment that must be reflected in our policies, our communication, and daily action. As we leave this forum, let's carry forward the voice of children who often go unheard. Let's make every child, regardless of where they live, who they are, what they have access to education, safety, clean air, and water, and the opportunity to thrive. Change begins with awareness, as Ariff mentioned a few times, communication, and it grows through collaboration and accountability. Together, we can ensure that every decision we make, especially in areas like climate change, social protection, and digital inclusion, is made with children in mind for their future. Thank you for being part of this dialogue and your continued commitment to making child right a living reality. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.